Shalom Havrim, James Trim here. You may have heard of the old Syriac version of the New Testament, and you may have heard of the old Latin version of the New Testament. But have you ever heard of the old Hebrew version? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get started, I need to ask everybody to please donate to support this work. For those that don't know, while I'm doing this work on Hebrew and Aramaic origins and Jewish backgrounds of the New Testament, I am also caretaker for my wife, who's chronically ill, suffers chronic pain, and is disabled. And I have to pick up a prescription for her that is almost $300. That's our cost after insurance. Okay. In addition, we have another $200 in bills hitting our account. So we really need to raise $500 in the next 24 hours or so, a little more than that, between 24 and 48 hours, because these are hitting our account Monday night. So I need to, by the end of the day tomorrow, cover those bills and pick up her pain medication. She suffers chronic pain. She cannot really be without her pain medication. So please donate to support this work that we are doing, and you can donate by clicking on the donate link in the video description. By clicking on that link, you can donate by PayPal, Zelle, or GoFundMe, or you can send donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. Okay? That's donations@wnae.org. I also want to ask everybody to please like this video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell so you'll get notified when new videos come out. Let us know what you think in the comments. Participate in discussions in the comments. Share this video with your friends on social media, Facebook groups where it's relevant, your Facebook page, X, formerly known as Twitter, any other social media in which you participate. Send it as private messages to your friends on social media and in email to your friends. Help us get the word out. Okay. All right. So as I said, today we're going to be talking about the old Hebrew version of Matthew. And the star of the show of this old Hebrew version of Matthew is the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, France, Hebrew manuscript number 132. And I've spoken frequently about this Hebrew version of Matthew. So we'll be talking about this Hebrew version of Matthew and other witnesses to this same Hebrew version of Matthew. It was Hugh Schoenfield who named this Hebrew version of Matthew in 1927 in his book, An Old Hebrew Manuscript of St. Matthew's Gospel. On page 17, he writes, the writer feels convinced that it may worthily rank, speaking of the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew, the DuTillet Hebrew text of Matthew, and all of the witnesses to this version of Matthew. At the time, I believe he was only aware of the DuTillet and Munster texts, which were two different texts of this same Hebrew version of Matthew. So he writes, the writer feels convinced that it may worthily rank with other ancient versions, and that scholars will now be able to quote the Old Hebrew alongside the Old Latin and the Old Syriac among their witnesses to the sacred text. So the first witness to this manuscript that I want to deal with is kind of the star of the show for this version. It's one that the most work has been done on to date. It's the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. And this was manuscript we've spoken of frequently on this channel, the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew. And we've talked about a lot of the internal evidence for that it descends from the original Hebrew of Matthew, and we have talked about its close relationship to the Old Syriac and how it frequently agrees with the Old Syriac against all other versions, which is important because the Old Syriac is a Aramaic version of the Gospels, the four Gospels, or actually the whole New Testament, but we only have survived to us the four Gospels. So it's a Aramaic version of the four Gospels that, or the whole New Testament, that was lost in ancient times and only resurfaced in the 19th century when two fragmentary manuscripts were found. Between the two of them, there were manuscripts of the four Gospels, not the whole New Testament. We have between the two of them that are both missing a lot of pages, about 95% of the four Gospels manuscript, the text, in this Old Syriac version. We also have an Old Latin version that is related to the Old Syriac. They're both part of the Western text type, along with the Western Greek text. The Western Greek text is interesting because it contains many Semitisms, that is Semitic, Hebrew, Aramaic grammar, that is absent from the Alexandrian and Byzantine Greek text types. So it's a very important primitive text type with a lot of underlying Hebrew and Aramaic behind it, and a close relationship to the Old Latin and Old Syriac. The Old Latin also appears to have an Aramaic basis behind it, and there's some places where it was clearly translated not from the Greek, but from some Aramaic version related to the Old Syriac. There's a lot of internal evidence that the Old Syriac descends from an ancient Aramaic version that was an ancient Jewish Aramaic version in a Jewish dialect of Aramaic. And there's a lot of Jewish Aramaic elements in the Aramaic of the Old Syriac that are not valid Syriac. They're bad Syriac, but they're good Jewish Aramaic. So there's a lot of very important information here in the very relationship. The DuTillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew and its allies, frankly, agree very closely with the Old Syriac, and in places against all other versions, even in one place, agreeing in having the same grammatical error. Aramaic and Hebrew are cognate languages and have similar grammar, and the same grammatical error occurs in the two of them that isn't found in any other version of Matthew. Okay, so the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew is very important. And where does it come from? Well, in 1553, it was confiscated from Jews in Rome. On August 12, 1553, at the petition of Pietro, Cardinal of Carafa, the Inquisitor General, Pope Julius, Pope Julius III signed a decree banning the Talmud in Rome. That decree was executed, unfortunately, on September 9th, Rosh Hashanah. And anything that even looked like a Talmud was confiscated from Jewish homes and synagogues as they were ransacked and ravished. So there was a bishop from France named Jean DuTillet from Brioude, France, and he was visiting Rome at the time, and he knew Hebrew. And so he was astonished to take notice of a Hebrew manuscript of Matthew among the Hebrew manuscripts that were heading for the fires. And so he rescued this Hebrew manuscript of Matthew, and he took it home with him, and he deposited it in the library, the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris, France, where it still exists as Hebrew manuscript 132. Now, most scholars have just ignored this Hebrew version of Matthew, but two important scholars have actually come to the conclusion that it descends from the original Hebrew of the book of Matthew. The first of these is Hugh Schoenfield. It's Hugh Schoenfield that actually, as I said, named the version we're talking about the Old Hebrew version. Hugh Schoenfield said about this Hebrew version of Matthew, also on page 17 of the same book, an Old Hebrew text of St. Matthew's Gospel. In 1927, he wrote, certain linguistic proofs, ... seem to show that the Hebrew text underlies the Greek, and that certain renderings in the Greek may be due to a misread Hebrew original. George Howard, Dr. George Howard, whom many of you may be familiar with because of his work on the Shem Tov Hebrew manuscript of Matthew, he did a write-up on this DuTillet text in the Journal of Biblical Literature 105/1, 1986, page 53. And in his write-up, he concluded that it was a translation from Greek, which it's not. He was wrong. But he realized he was wrong before it was too late. So he put in a footnote to his change of mind, and the footnote, which is note 34 on page 63, he says that it is, quote, a revision of an earlier Hebrew Matthew, which he says is related to the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew, which he also says about the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew that the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew descends from a Hebrew text which served as a model for our present Greek text. So, in other words, George Howard was saying that the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew descends from the original Hebrew. Now, I differ with him on whether the Shem Tov is more closer to the original Hebrew than DuTillet, but in any case, he recognized that DuTillet was a descendant of the original Hebrew of the book. I actually have a copy of his write-up right here, and it's titled The Textual Nature of an Old Hebrew Version of Matthew. So he accepted Schoenfield's name, the Old Hebrew Version, and I think we should be using that because it is absolutely appropriate. It has a unique relationship with the Old Syriac that has a relationship with the Old Latin. They all have a relationship together. And by the way, the Old Syriac and Old Latin have such a close relationship with themselves and with the Greek Western type text that which I mentioned has more Aramaic grammar and Hebrew grammar in it than the other text types in the Greek. That Greek text type actually used to be called the Syro-Latin text type because of its agreement with the Old Syriac and the Old Latin. And here we have an Old Hebrew version that has an affinity with them as well. And we should be recognizing that. The DuTillet Hebrew manuscript is not the only witness we have to this version. We also have the Munster Hebrew text of Matthew. Now, the Munster Hebrew text of Matthew is not a manuscript. It's a printed edition in 1537. Sebastian Munster published this in 1537, and again in 1557 it was republished shortly after his death. And he claimed to have received his Hebrew text from the Jews. Now, what's interesting about the 1557 version, by the way, published after his death, is it also included a Hebrew version of the book of Hebrews that was also obtained from among the Jews. And of course, I get ahead of myself because he noted that he received this Hebrew text of Matthew from, quote, among the Jews. And he received it in, quote, defective condition with many holes, or many lacunae, which he himself filled in. Unfortunately, he didn't take steps to preserve the manuscript source is now lost, and he didn't take note of the places he filled in the missing text. Oh, at least that's the story. But as it turns out, as we scrutinize what he actually said, and what happened is we have this this case of telephone, or gossip, the old game goes, where the story gets repeated and it gets wrong. Okay, so what he actually said was that it had many lacerations, and the actual text of what Munster said, instead of what he's been misunderstood as saying, is that his text was divided up into sections. Now, for those that don't know, the Shem Tov text was divided up into sections, and after each section, the rabbinical scribe, after each section, Shem Tov gave his objections to that section of text. Because the Shem Tov text was published in an edition called the Touchstone as a guide for rabbinic Jews who were going to be going up in debates against Christians. Okay? And the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew has a list of objections at the end of the manuscript, but it's not divided up. It's all together, and all the objections are at the end. And I think what Munster was saying was that his text wasn't all divided up, or it was all divided up, and he put it all back together again, and he eliminated the rabbinic objections. Okay? So the Munster Hebrew text is another witness, reads very similarly to the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript. Now, I have in my library here a facsimile of the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. I also have photocopies of every page of Munster's 1537 publication. An interesting thing also is that Munster's Hebrew text of Matthew, which he published, that he obtained from among the Jews, was titled The Torah of the Messiah. Apparently the title that it had when he received it from the Jews. So here's the title page of Munster's 1537 edition of Hebrew Matthew that he obtained from among the Jews, what we call the Munster text, and it's titled The Torah of the Messiah. Now, one of Munster's students was a guy, let me see if I can pronounce this name, Johannes Quinquerbus of Aurelia. And he was also a Hebrew teacher, but he was a student of Munster, and he published an edition of Hebrew Matthew almost identical to Munster's. And in his preface, this is a translation of his Latin preface. He published this in 1551. So he published it after the 1537 publication of the Munster text, but before the 1553 publication of the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew that was confiscated from Jews in Rome. And he wrote in his preface, "I would not dare to affirm anything on the matter that what I think is needful in consideration of a sufficiency of authorities," he says plural, that'll be important here. "If, however, Munster had recommended to us an almost certainly better restorations or additions of his own suggestion by asterisk, or whatever other sign he noted them, to the extent that we know the style and phraseology of the ancient author, the better judgment has been placed on the author." So, in other words, he followed in his edition that he published the original author, if you will, rather than Munster's text. And then this is the key phrase he says, when St. Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew, I think, following the many opinions of illustrious men saying so, that no one, unless he wanted to be tarnished or resist the truth, would turn in such a true pearl for a marble. In other words, what he was saying was that this is the original Hebrew of Matthew, and I wouldn't change a thing. In fact, I even didn't accept any minor restorations that Munster made by asterisk, referring to the text in footnotes. I stood by the original text. And here is, excuse me. He included marginal notes offering alternate readings from other Hebrew manuscripts of Matthew in his possession. And a really interesting aspect is that in some cases, those agree with the DuTillet manuscript that hadn't been published yet when he published this, which tells us that he was, in fact, giving alternate readings from other Hebrew manuscripts of the same text that were in his possession, that were in circulation amongst the Jews at the time. And which means his many marginal notes are also witnesses to the original Hebrew text of Matthew that we can take into account. The last manuscript I want to talk about is a manuscript that we have titled the Garza-Trim manuscript. And this manuscript was, it was in a library, of course, but it was located by my good friend Albert Garza. Garza done a lot of work on locating Hebrew manuscripts of New Testament books. As it turns out, there are hundreds of Hebrew manuscripts of New Testament books, thousands of pages. And there are many Hebrew manuscripts of New Testament books in libraries, monasteries, museums around the world, and there was not a lot of work done on it, and they have only come to light because in the modern age, a lot of these libraries have started digitizing their manuscript holdings and making that information available online. And so you didn't have to travel around all over the world to different locations. And many of them were making these manuscripts available where you could obtain them digitally. Some of them are even online on the internet digitally now. So one of these manuscripts is a manuscript that was located by Al Garza. Now, Albert Garza, Dr. Albert Garza, located like 4,000 pages of Hebrew manuscripts of New Testament books, which he's forwarded to me for analysis. The vast majority of these can be demonstrated to be translations of the Latin Vulgate, of the received Greek text, the Byzantine type Greek text, even some cases of the Peshitta Aramaic version. But one of these manuscripts, it turns out, being a manuscript of all of Matthew, all of Mark, and Luke through chapter 17, turned out to be very interesting for two reasons. One is the title page, which was actually at the back of the manuscript, sort of a colophon, and the title page right here also calls the whole text of the four Gospels. Kind of gave away something here. It was originally a manuscript of the four Gospels from which the scribe was copying. He He says so in his preface, but he didn't finish copying the text. He stopped in Luke 17. We don't know what happened. Maybe he died. I don't know. But he stopped copying at the end of Luke chapter 17 and didn't copy the rest of Luke or the Gospel of John. But we do have the first three Gospels, at least most of them, through to Luke 17. Another interesting aspect is that the title page to this manuscript says that it was hidden up in caves, and it was brought to light by Jews who had hidden their testimonies. And it's also called the Torah of Messiah, just like the Hebrew manuscript of Matthew that Sebastian Munster published. By the way, Sebastian Munster published his edition in 1537. A subsequent edition of his work was published shortly after his death in 1557 by his publisher, which also included a Hebrew version of the book of Hebrews, which Sebastian Munster had obtained from among the Jews in an appendix. Just some information you might want to be aware of. Okay, so this Hebrew manuscript of Matthew, I have been working on the analysis of and on a translation of it. And I found a number of correlations with the Old Syriac. There's a lot of work left to do, okay? Even with the, I believe I found some with the Luke portion, for example. There's a lot of work left to do, but this may be, one of the first things I discovered as I was translating is that the Hebrew manuscript of Matthew is definitely a member of or an example of the Old Hebrew version. It is a great deal of agreement with the DuTillet, Munster, Quinquerbos texts. Okay, so it agrees with them to a large extent. Not always, has its variations, but many places that are too close and where it agrees with them against all other versions. So it can't be coincidence. But unlike our other three witnesses that I mentioned, this witness also includes the Gospel of Mark and Luke chapters 1 through 17. So this very well may be, or provide us with an old Hebrew version of Mark and an old Hebrew version of most of Luke. Now I've made videos about several videos about DuTillet, videos about the Old Syriac, the Western Greek text type. I've made past videos about the Garza-Trim text and about the Munster text. So I've made videos about all of these in the past. But I'm kind of bringing this all together because this all together constitutes an Old Hebrew version. Apparently old Hebrew version of the four Gospels, although we only have all of Matthew, Mark, and the first 17 chapters of Luke surviving. So I'll keep you updated on the work on the Garza-Trim text and whether it holds up that the Mark and Luke could really be classed as part of this Old Hebrew version. Definitely Matthew can. So we have an Old Hebrew version, and we can now and should be talking about this Old Hebrew version as a version of Matthew right next to the Old Syriac and the Old Latin. So we have and this is a Hebrew version of Matthew that descends from the original Hebrew that was the work of Matthew himself. All right, one more time before we wrap up here. I want to remind everybody to please donate to support this work. You can do that by clicking on the donate link in the video description. And you can also donate by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. That's donations@wnae.org. Don't forget to like our video, subscribe to the channel, click on the notification bell. Let us know what you think in the comments about this Old Hebrew version of Matthew, and participate in the discussions in the comments section. Don't forget to share this video with your friends on social media, on Facebook, in relevant Facebook groups, on X, formerly known as Twitter, any other social media. Share it in private messages on social media with your friends and in email with your friends, and help us get the word out. Until next time, everybody,